On his deathbed, 89-year-old Walter Hammond, frail and gasping for air, gripped his daughter's hand with surprising strength. "I've kept a secret for 50 years, he whispered, his voice trembling. "There's a body in the backyard." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession suffocating. As Walter took his last breath, his daughter stared in disbelief. Who was buried there? Why? And why now, after decades, did he choose to reveal the horrifying truth? The old man lay on the hospital bed, his frail body barely recognizable under the thin sheets. Walter Hammond had always been a towering figure in his family, a man of principle and mystery. But now, at 89 years old, his chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath sounding more labored than the last. His daughter, Grace, sat at his bedside, holding his hand, feeling the roughness of skin that had weathered decades of hard work. "Grace," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. She leaned in closer, the smell of antiseptic filling her nostrils. "I need to tell you something." "Dad, save your strength," Grace said softly, though her heart tightened at the urgency in his tone. "No, it can't wait," he croaked. His thin fingers tightened around hers with surprising strength. "I've kept a secret. For 50 years. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She had always suspected her father harbored secrets, but this felt different. "What is it, Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling. Walter's eyes darted around the room as if checking for unseen watchers. Then, with a final shuddering breath, he said, "There's a body in the backyard." For a moment, Grace thought she had misheard. A body? The words hung in the air, surreal and heavy. Her pulse quickened as she searched his face for some sign this was a cruel joke or a hallucination brought on by medication. But Walter's expression was grave, his gaze unwavering. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her throat tightening. "It's buried. Under the oak tree," he said, each word a struggle. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Grace stared at him, her mind reeling. This was her father, the man who had raised her, who had taught her right from wrong. The idea that he could be capable of something so heinous was unthinkable. And yet the conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. Before she could ask another question, Walter's eyes closed, his body going slack. The monitors emitted a long, piercing beep, and the room was flooded with nurses. Grace was pushed aside as they tried to revive him, but she knew it was too late. Her father was gone, leaving her with a confession that shattered everything she thought she knew. In the hours that followed, Grace sat alone in the hospital's waiting room, her mind racing. Memories of her childhood flashed before her. The lazy afternoons under the shade of the oak tree, her father watching from the porch with a smile. Had he been hiding this dark secret all along? And if so, why had he chosen to reveal it now, on his deathbed? By the time she returned to her family's home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. The old oak tree stood tall and imposing, its gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal arms. Grace couldn't bring herself to look at it for long. Instead, she went inside, her father's words echoing in her mind. Her husband, Daniel, met her at the door, his face etched with concern. "How's your dad?" he asked. "He's gone," Grace said flatly, brushing past him. Daniel followed her into the kitchen where she poured herself a glass of water with trembling hands. "I'm so sorry, Grace," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Is there anything I can do?" She shook her head, unable to speak. How could she explain what she had just learned? How could she tell him that the man they had buried today had admitted to burying someone else? Over the next few days, Grace became consumed by her father's confession. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything else. The backyard, once a place of comfort, now felt ominous, as if it held a malevolent presence. She avoided going near the oak tree, but its shadow seemed to loom over her no matter where she went. Finally, she decided she couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. One night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Grace grabbed a flashlight and a shovel and made her way into the backyard. The air was cool and still, the only sound the chirping of crickets. She stood at the base of the oak tree, its massive trunk towering over her, and took a deep breath. "I need to know," she whispered. She began to dig, the shovel cutting into the earth with a dull thud. With each scoop of soil, her heart pounded harder, the anticipation mingling with dread. After what felt like an eternity, her shovel hit something solid. Grace froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knelt down, brushing away the dirt with trembling hands, and uncovered what appeared to be a piece of fabric, old, tattered, and stained. Pulling it aside, she revealed what lay beneath: a skeletal hand, its bony fingers curled as if reaching for something. Grace let out a strangled gasp, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the ground, its beam casting eerie shadows on the tree trunk. She stumbled backward, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. She had to call the police. She had to find out who this person was, how they had ended up here, and why her father had buried them. But as she stood there, staring at the skeletal remains, a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if she didn't want to know the truth? What if some secrets were better left buried? The air was heavy with tension as the police arrived, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows against the old oak tree. Grace stood at the edge of the yard, arms crossed tightly, watching as they worked. The officers moved methodically, marking the ground with cones and taking photographs before exhuming the remains. Grace couldn't bring herself to look again. The brief glimpse she'd had was enough to haunt her. Detective Samuel Carter approached, his expression grim. He was tall, his weathered face speaking of years spent unraveling human depravity. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice steady, "thank you for calling this in. Can you tell me exactly what led you to discover this?" Grace hesitated, her fingers tightening around the hem of her sweater. How could she explain? Would they believe her? Taking a deep breath, she recounted her father's deathbed confession, omitting nothing. As the words spilled out, she felt as though she were reliving the moment, the disbelief, the crushing weight of his final words. Detective Carter listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying nothing until she finished. "Your father confessed to burying this body 50 years ago?" he repeated, his tone neutral. "Yes," Grace whispered. "He said he didn't mean for it to happen." Carter rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the tree. "We'll need to conduct a full investigation. I understand this is your family home, but we'll have to treat it as a crime scene." Grace nodded numbly. "Do you know who it might be?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It's too early to say," Carter replied, "but we'll do everything we can to find out." As the forensic team worked late into the night, Grace retreated to the house where Daniel was waiting. His face was pale, his eyes wide with worry. "What did they say?" he asked as she stepped into the living room. "They're investigating," she replied, sinking onto the couch. "They don't know yet." Daniel sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "This doesn't make any sense, Grace. Your dad, he wasn't a killer." "I know," she said, though her voice wavered. "But why would there be a body out there?" They sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Grace's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories from her childhood. Had there been signs she'd missed? Odd behaviors? But nothing came to mind. The next morning, Detective Carter returned with more questions. He wanted to know about her father's life, his habits, his relationships. Grace answered as best as she could, though she found herself second-guessing everything. What had once seemed like harmless quirks now felt sinister under suspicion. "We found something," Carter said finally, his tone grave. "It's unusual." Grace's heart leapt into her throat. "What is it?" The detective hesitated before pulling out a small evidence bag. Inside was a tarnished locket, its clasp broken and chain twisted. "This was found with the remains," he said. "Do you recognize it?" Grace stared at the locket, her brow furrowing. It looked familiar, but she couldn't place it. "No," she said finally. "I don't think so." "We're running tests," Carter said. "It might help us identify the victim." The mention of the victim made Grace's stomach churn. She had tried not to think about the person buried under the oak tree, but now she couldn't help imagining who they might have been. A neighbor? A stranger? Someone her father had known? The possibilities were endless, each more horrifying than the last. Over the next few days, the investigation consumed her life. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing every time she stepped out. The neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their curiosity tinged with fear. Grace felt like a prisoner in her own home, trapped by the weight of her father's secrets. Finally, a breakthrough came. Detective Carter called her late one evening, his voice tense. "We've identified the victim," he said. "Her name was Abigail Pierce. She went missing 50 years ago." Grace's breath caught. "Who was she?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're still piecing that together," Carter replied, "but it looks like she was local. Old records indicate she lived not far from here." The revelation sent a shiver down Grace's spine. Abigail Pierce. The name meant nothing to her, but it felt heavy with significance. "Did my father know her?" she asked hesitantly. "We don't know yet," Carter admitted, "but we'll find out." As she hung up the phone, Grace felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that the victim had a name, dread at what that name might uncover. She couldn't shake the feeling this was only the beginning, that the truth about her father and Abigail Pierce would be far darker than she imagined. That night, she dreamed of the oak tree, its branches twisted like gnarled fingers, reaching out as if to pull her into its shadowy depths. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, and stared out the window at the silhouette of the tree against the moonlit sky. Somewhere beneath its roots, the secrets of the past waited, and Grace wasn't sure she was ready to face them. Grace could hardly process the name, Abigail Pierce. The victim finally had an identity, but that only opened a chasm of questions. Who was she? How did her life end up entwined with her father's? And why had he confessed after decades of silence? These thoughts swirled in her mind as she sat at the kitchen table staring at the tarnished locket Detective Carter had left for analysis. It seemed innocuous, but its weight was suffocating. By the time the sun rose, Grace hadn't slept. She felt like a trespasser in her own home, the walls steeped in unfamiliar darkness. She avoided the backyard entirely. Every glance toward the oak tree sent a wave of nausea through her. The skeleton had been removed, but its ominous presence lingered. Detective Carter returned that afternoon, his face etched with fatigue. "Mrs. Bennett," he began, sitting across from her, "we've been digging through old reports. Abigail Pierce was reported missing in 1973. She was 27 and worked as a secretary. Her disappearance was suspicious, but never solved." Grace's fingers tightened around the table. "Do you think my father killed her?" The words tasted bitter, but she had to ask. Carter hesitated. "We're not drawing conclusions yet, but your father's connection to her is troubling. Abigail lived 2 streets over. Neighbors reported seeing her at your house before she vanished." The air seemed to leave the room. Grace felt as though the ground had shifted. "She was here?" she whispered. "It's possible," Carter said. "We're looking into your father's history. Do you remember anything unusual about him during that time?" Grace would have been a child in 1973, no older than 8. Her memories were fragmented. "I don't remember much," she admitted. "He worked hard, loved my mom and me. Nothing seemed strange." Carter nodded. "If anything comes to mind, let us know." After he left, Grace wandered the house, her mind heavy with questions. She found herself in the attic, a place she hadn't visited in years. The space smelled of dust and aged wood. Boxes lined the walls, each a trove of forgotten memories. She opened a box labeled 1970s and began sifting through its contents. Old photographs, faded letters, and trinkets spilled out. But one item caught her attention: a photograph of a woman she didn't recognize. She was young, with soft blonde curls and a warm smile. Grace flipped the photo over. Written in her father's handwriting were the words, "Abigail, summer, 73. Her heart raced. Abigail Pierce had been in their lives, closer than she'd imagined. But why? What had drawn her father and this woman together? And what had led to her death? She spent the next hour combing the attic, but found nothing else. Frustrated, she returned to the kitchen and called Detective Carter. "I found something," she said, her voice shaking. "A photograph. It's her. It's Abigail." Carter arrived within the hour, taking the photograph as evidence. "This could be significant," he said. "It places her in your father's life." As the investigation deepened, Grace became isolated. Friends and neighbors avoided her, their curiosity eclipsed by fear. Daniel tried to comfort her, but even he seemed unsure of what to say. "We'll get through this," he said one night, but the words felt hollow. The forensic team uncovered more unsettling details. Traces of blood were found on the locket, and tests confirmed it belonged to Abigail. The cause of death was undetermined, but the evidence painted a grim picture. Grace couldn't escape the growing suspicion that her father had been involved in something horrific. One night, unable to sleep, she ventured into the backyard. The oak tree loomed above her, its branches twisting against the night sky. She stared at the spot where the skeleton had been unearthed, her thoughts a chaotic storm. "Why, Dad?" she whispered into the darkness. Her voice was swallowed by the stillness. But as she turned to go back inside, a faint sound stopped her, a creaking, like the groan of wood under pressure. She froze, her heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from the tree. She stepped closer, her flashlight trembling. The creaking stopped. Grace stared up at the tree, its massive trunk solid. But something about it felt wrong. The air around it seemed heavier, colder. Shaking her head, she forced herself to turn away. It was just her imagination, she told herself. The next morning, Detective Carter called. "We've discovered something else," he said. Abigail wasn't just anyone. She was engaged to a man named Richard Steele. He's still alive and living in the next town over. We've contacted him, and he's willing to speak with us. I think you should be there." Grace hesitated. "Why me?" "Because he might remember something about your father. Something that could help us understand what happened." Reluctantly, Grace agreed. She wasn't sure she was ready to face someone who had loved Abigail, someone who might confirm the worst about her father. But she needed answers. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of time and silence, and Grace was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The drive to meet Richard Steele felt endless. Grace gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as her mind churned through countless possibilities. What would he say? Would he confirm her father's guilt, or reveal another connection to Abigail Pierce? The uncertainty gnawed at her. Detective Carter rode silently in the passenger seat, flipping through a notepad. "Are you ready for this?" he finally asked. "No," Grace replied honestly, "but I don't have a choice." They arrived at a modest bungalow on the outskirts of town. Richard Steele, now in his 70s, opened the door before they could knock. His face was lined with age, but his piercing blue eyes still held sharpness. "Detective Carter," he greeted, his voice steady but weary. His gaze shifted to Grace. "You must be Walter Hammond's daughter." Grace's stomach tightened at the mention of her father's name. "Yes," she said softly. Richard gestured for them to enter. The house was simple but cozy, filled with photographs of smiling family members. Grace's eyes landed on a framed picture of a young woman with blonde curls, Abigail. Richard noticed her staring and picked up the frame. She was beautiful, wasn't she? he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about her." Detective Carter cleared his throat. "Mr. Steele, we appreciate you speaking with us. Abigail's remains were discovered recently, and we're piecing together what happened." Richard's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the photograph. "After 50 years, you finally found her," he said bitterly. "Do you know how many nights I spent wondering, thinking of what I could have done differently?" "We're working on it," Carter said. "Do you remember Walter Hammond? Did he cross paths with Abigail?" Richard set the photograph down carefully. "Yes, I remember him. Abigail mentioned him a few times. Said he was kind, quiet, reminded her of her father." Grace's heart sank. She wanted to believe her father was innocent, but the connection was undeniable. Richard continued, his tone sharper. "She helped him with something, some paperwork, I think, but then she started acting. Strange, distant. I asked what was wrong, but she brushed it off." "What do you think happened?" Carter asked. "I don't know," Richard admitted. "The last time I saw her, she was upset. Said she had to meet someone but wouldn't say who. That was the night she disappeared." Grace felt a chill. "Did she mention my father that night?" she asked. Richard hesitated. "No," he said, "but she mentioned the oak tree, said it was important." Grace's breath caught. The oak tree, where Abigail's remains were found. The connection was undeniable, but it deepened the mystery. "Mr. Steele," Carter said, "do you think Walter Hammond could have harmed Abigail?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he admitted. "He seemed harmless. But you never really know people." The rest of the interview passed in a blur. Richard provided what little he could, but the pieces didn't fit together. Grace left feeling more lost than ever. Back home, she retreated to the attic, hoping to find something to explain her father's connection to Abigail. Just as she was about to give up, she found a small, locked box. It was plain, but something about it felt significant. She carried it downstairs and rummaged through the kitchen drawers until she found a key. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the box. Inside was a stack of letters, yellowed with age. The top one was addressed to her father, written in neat handwriting. Grace's heart pounded as she unfolded it. "Dear Walter," it began, "thank you for your kindness. I don't know what I would have done without you. You've been a true friend. But I'm scared. He's watching me. I don't know who else to turn to." The letter was unsigned, but Grace knew who had written it. Abigail Pierce. She read the rest of the letters, each one more desperate. Abigail had been afraid of someone following her, threatening her, and her father had been trying to help. Grace's hands shook as she pieced it together. Had her father been protecting Abigail? Or had he failed her? The answers felt just out of reach. The next morning, she called Carter and told him about the letters. "This changes everything," he said. "We need to figure out who Abigail was afraid of. This could solve the case." As the investigation pressed on, Grace found herself drawn to the oak tree. She stood beneath its gnarled branches, staring at the disturbed earth. The secrets it held seemed closer than ever, but she wasn't sure she was ready. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Grace froze, her heart pounding. She turned, half expecting to see someone, but the yard was empty. Shaking her head, she told herself it was just the wind. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the oak tree was trying to tell her something. Grace couldn't stop thinking about the letters. The words echoed in her mind. "He's watching me. I don't know who else to turn to." Who was he? And why had her father kept these letters hidden? The questions weighed on her as she met Detective Carter at the station the next morning. Carter placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. "We've been combing through Abigail's letters," he began. "The details are vague, but it's clear she was terrified. The handwriting suggests these were written in the weeks leading up to her disappearance." Grace nodded, her hands gripping the cup for warmth. She was scared of someone. But why didn't she go to the police? Fear, Carter replied. Maybe she didn't trust the system or thought it wouldn't help. What's clear is that your father became her confidant. The letters paint him as a protector, not a threat. Grace wanted to believe her father had been trying to help, but the discovery of Abigail's body under the oak tree cast doubt over everything. We found something else, Carter said, sliding a file across the desk. Inside were transcripts from interviews conducted in 1973. One name stood out, Richard Steele. He was questioned? Grace asked. Yes, Carter confirmed. As Abigail's fiancé, he was questioned extensively. He had an alibi and was cleared, but something he said caught my attention. He mentioned a man Abigail had been meeting, a man she described as dangerous. Unfortunately, he couldn't provide a name. Grace's stomach churned. You think this man might be the one she was afraid of? It's a possibility, Carter said. We're digging into records from that time to see if there's anyone who fits the description. The conversation left Grace feeling uneasy. She returned home, determined to find more answers. Hours passed as she scoured the attic and her father's belongings, but nothing stood out. Exhausted, she collapsed onto the couch, her mind racing. That night, she dreamed of the oak tree. Its branches stretched out like skeletal fingers, reaching for her. The wind carried whispers she couldn't decipher, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, as though something buried deep within was trying to surface. She woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The next morning, Carter called. We've identified someone who might be connected to Abigail, he said. His name is Charles Whitaker. He lived in the area during the 1970s and has a record, arrests for stalking and harassment. He left town shortly after Abigail disappeared. Grace's pulse quickened. Do you think he could be the man she was afraid of? It's too soon to say, Carter replied, but we've tracked him down. He's in a nearby city. I'm planning to pay him a visit. I want to come, Grace said before she could stop herself. Carter hesitated. Are you sure? This could be dangerous. I need to know, she insisted. If he knows anything about what happened to Abigail, I need to hear it. Reluctantly, Carter agreed. They drove in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. When they arrived at Whitaker's rundown apartment building, Grace felt a knot form in her stomach. Whitaker opened the door after several knocks. He was in his 70s, his posture hunched, his eyes darting nervously. Who are you? He demanded. Detective Carter, Carter said, flashing his badge. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Abigail Pierce. Whitaker's face paled. I don't know anything, he said quickly, attempting to shut the door, but Carter blocked it with his foot. We know you knew her, Carter pressed, and we know you left town shortly after she disappeared. That's quite the coincidence. Whitaker's hands trembled. I didn't do anything to her, he stammered. She was scared. She told me someone was after her. Who? Grace asked, stepping forward. Who was she afraid of? Whitaker's eyes flicked to her, then back to Carter. I don't know his name, he admitted, but she said he wouldn't leave her alone. He was watching her every move. Grace's breath caught. The description matched the letters. Why did you leave town? She asked. Whitaker hesitated. Because I was scared, too, he said finally. I saw him once, outside her house. He was tall, wearing a dark coat. He looked wrong, like he didn't belong. The interview yielded little else, but it left Grace with a sense of foreboding. Back at home, she couldn't shake the image of the man Whitaker had described. Who was he? And why had he fixated on Abigail? That night, Grace found herself in the backyard again, standing beneath the oak tree. The air was still, the moon casting long shadows across the grass. She placed a hand on the tree's rough bark, its surface cold against her skin. Who are you? She whispered, though she wasn't sure who or what she was addressing. The tree seemed to hum beneath her touch, a low vibration that sent chills down her spine. She pulled her hand away, her breath quickening. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves. Grace turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the yard was empty. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Inside, she locked the doors and closed the blinds, but the unease lingered. She sat by the window, staring out at the oak tree. It loomed in the darkness, its branches swaying gently in the wind. For the first time, she wondered if the secrets it held went beyond anything she could comprehend. The oak tree loomed in Grace's dreams again, its gnarled branches twisting against the moonlit sky. She woke with a start, the whispers of her father's guilt echoing in her ears. Something had shifted, and she knew the answers were closer than ever. The call from Detective Carter came at sunrise. "We've uncovered something," he said. "The fingerprints on Abigail's letters belong to Daniel Mercer. He lived nearby in the 1970s, had a record for assault and stalking, and disappeared shortly after Abigail went missing." Grace's stomach dropped. "Do you think he's the one Abigail was afraid of?" "All signs point to yes," Carter replied. "We also found something else, a storage unit registered in his name. We've obtained a warrant to search it." Grace insisted on joining the team. Hours later, they arrived at a dimly lit storage facility. The musty air inside the unit clung to her skin as Carter pried open a large trunk. Inside were dozens of items: old photographs, scraps of paper, and a journal. Grace's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, each one filled with obsessive notes about Abigail. "She doesn't know I'm watching her," one entry read, "but she'll know soon. She'll understand. She belongs to me." At the bottom of the trunk lay something chilling: a blood-stained scarf, Abigail's scarf, along with a box containing her engagement ring. Grace's heart clenched as Carter handed her another item, a faded envelope addressed to her father. "Walter," it read in shaky handwriting. "He's always watching. I can't escape him, but maybe you can protect her. Don't let him win." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. "My father was trying to save her," she said, her voice breaking. "But he couldn't. Mercer must have found out." The discoveries brought them closer to the truth, but questions lingered. Why had Mercer disappeared? And what drove her father to bury the past under the oak tree? Back at home, Grace returned to the attic, determined to find more clues. Her search uncovered a hidden journal, its pages brittle with age. One entry, dated weeks before Abigail's death, caught her attention. "She came to me tonight," her father had written. "She's terrified. I told her I'd protect her, but I don't know how. He's watching her, and now he's watching me too." The journal confirmed what Grace had feared. Her father had been caught in Mercer's twisted web. But why had he buried Abigail's body instead of going to the authorities? Grace couldn't rest until she had answers. That night she returned to the oak tree, its looming presence both familiar and haunting. She dug into the soil once more, her fingers scraping against something solid. It was another box, smaller than the first. Inside was a final letter from her father. "Abigail," it read, "I failed you. I couldn't stop him, and now it's too late. Forgive me. I did what I could to protect you, but I wasn't strong enough." The weight of her father's guilt washed over Grace as she clutched the letter. He had carried this burden to his grave, but now the truth was clear. He had tried to save Abigail from a monster, but in the end he had only been able to bury her pain and his own beneath the oak tree. As dawn broke, Grace stood beneath the tree one last time. The whispers she had heard for weeks were gone, replaced by a profound silence. It was as though the tree itself had found peace, its secrets finally laid bare. Walking back to the house, Grace made a silent promise to Abigail and her father. She couldn't change the past, but she would make sure their story was never forgotten. The truth, once buried, would now live on.